How do you do? True Story FM feels it would be a little unkind to present this podcast without just a word of friendly warning. Sitting in the Dark is about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image without reckoning upon God. It is one of the strangest tales ever told. It deals with the two great mysteries of creation, life and death. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It may even horrify you. So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to, well, we warned you.
You're listening to Sitting in the Dark, the new horror podcast from True Story FM. Thank you for joining us today. I am Ray DeLancey, and joining me is Kyle Olson, the handsomest man in the room.
This man, this monster, this beard.
And Pete Wright, the second handsomest man in the room, only because his beard is just a tad shorter than Kyle's.
I'm really excited about this, Dr. Frankenstein. I'm very excited about this, about diving into your fetish monster.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm excited about it too. You know, there's just something about cadavers that really gets my blood warm, you know? There's one thing I just want to say before we start here. I'm extremely thrilled for this opportunity because I've always been a fan of these movies, and I feel like they get an unfair bias because of their age. And I think that if we take a chance to look at what these movies bring to the table, it will broaden our horizons and give us a better appreciation for these, not because they're old, but because they're good.
I think it's an interesting thing to start with this particular monster for this particular show, Sitting in the Dark. You know, in our introductory episode, we had this conversation about, you know, pushing boundaries on movies that scare us and talking about horror movies. And I think it's fascinating that we start with a monster that isn't necessarily in these early movies, isn't necessarily scary, right? There's nothing that's particularly horrific about them, but I still had, to your point, an outstanding experience watching these movies. The restorations that I watched were impeccable. And I think they have been really cared for. So why are they so easy to lampoon? Well, their age. So, you know, I'm excited to dig into it. I have very little history with Frankenstein, the monster, apart from the original, the Shelley book, which I know Kyle's going to talk about, and Young Frankenstein. And I probably watched these when they were on, you know, cable when I was a kid, but I don't really have a memory of it.
I got to ask you this question since you brought up Young Frankenstein, and this goes for both of you. How many times when you were watching these movies did you say, "Oh, that's the part from Young Frankenstein"?
All the time.
So much. So
all the time.
Especially in Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
There's,
yeah.
I didn't realize how much they pulled from that to bring over. I was like, oh.
What it was really funny to me, at least my observation, was like watching. In some cases, it felt like they didn't even take much away to make it a joke. Like it was the same scene. And in Young Frankenstein, it's funny. And in this movie, it was ostensibly not funny. I thought that was crazy.
Oh, that's like in the movie Son of Frankenstein, which comes directly after Bride. That's where we get the character of Inspector Krogh, who has the wooden arm. And I am not able to watch that movie seriously anymore because Young Frankenstein made it such a funny bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're here and we're going to be covering one of the most famed stories of all time, written in 1818, I think. But we're actually going to let our resident Mary Shelley historian, Mr. Kyle Olson, tell you a little bit more about the history of the novel and of its young author.
Yeah, I'd say I'm only expert by default in the room. Basically, I use Mary
That's enough.
Shelley in a story that I wrote, and so I ended up digging into and really was fascinated by her life and stuff too. So I wanted to basically talk about sort of the original creator before we sort of dig into all the adaptations, because as the adaptations go along, they drift farther and farther from her original vision, and she in her lifetime fought for credit a lot of times and lost many times too. So I wanted to sort of go back and sort of give her due. So none more goth than Mary Shelley. She had her life was consumed by death, surrounded by death. It was everywhere around her. She lost her mother before she, at like 11 days after she was born. She learned to write by like following the letters on her mother's gravestone. The same grave where she eventually would have her first carnal relations with a man. You cannot get more goth than Mary Shelley. So then obviously the famous story is that she was with her then married lover at a chateau with a couple of other friends, and then they all had a contest to see like who could come up with the scariest story. And so she had this sort of idea. There's different versions of like she saw in a dream of a half-formed man trying to kill her, or possibly like she had heard the story of the real Frankenstein, which is a guy who would dig up bodies and sort of to examine them, and that ended up in the local town ended up being kind of a thing, and sort of combined all these things to have this story of a creator who made a man essentially and then instantly regretted it because it ended up destroying his life. This like the idea of like the creation ended up destroying it. It was interesting to see sort of as the story develops how much that sort of same idea keeps coming around of like regret and like you want to conquer death, you want to go beyond stuff, and yet, oh no, I've made a terrible decision. And that seems to be a recurring theme that runs through all of it. But even at the time, she did not really get credit. Everybody assumed, oh no, your husband must have written this, because obviously her husband was a huge writer celebrity at the time, and so everybody's like, oh no, you just had some ideas, and he's the one that actually wrote it. So much so that even in the title sequence of Frankenstein, she is not credited as Mary Shelley. She is credited as Miss Shelley. Like not even none of her name is actually on the screen. Like none of it. I was like, oh, this is exactly why I wanted to make this point. Like this is even at 18, she came up with this idea like this, and obviously it was published, I think, when she was 21, and then her whole life people were just like, oh. You came up with that.
Just men have been classy throughout history, right?
Deserves her due. And luckily in Bride of Frankenstein, she is properly credited and also then appears on screen. So like, justice had been paid at least a little bit along that way. But and so as we go along, and we're going to talk about addition stuff too, I just want to make sure that people remember this is Mary Shelley's story. This is her creation, and everything out there comes from her. She was a libertine. She lived a very unconventional life and romances and stuff outside the norms of society. People, clutching their pearls along a lot of her decision things too, and was the daughter of a feminist and continued feminist movement. She was like very much ahead of her time and just like had just an unfortunate life and an unfortunate timing. But her legacy lives on.
Isn't it interesting too that so many of the sort of tropes that come out of Frankenstein that keep evolving come from her and are about men destroying their lives?
Yeah. Yeah.
Power move, Mary Shelley.
Right.
Power move.
I think we all basically know the story of Frankenstein. So let's go ahead and talk about whenever they first started doing film adaptations.
I had never seen the first, it was the 1910 version of Frankenstein. I'd never seen it, and I was fascinated by the fact that they cooked up the monster in a vat. That was awesome.
That is pretty great.
Thematically, that's much closer to because you don't in the book you don't really get to know what it is because Victor Frankenstein, not Henry,
right? Not Henry.
Kept his secrets. Like he did not want to say exactly how this was going because he didn't want anyone else to duplicate his work. So
yeah,
that was a valid, I thought, interpretation of it.
I think it's funny that whenever the film was advertised, it was described as, quote, a liberal adaptation of the Mary Shelley novel. So this movie was made by Thomas Edison's production company, which made short films in the early 20th century. And whenever they were working on getting the film made, they wanted to make it clear that this was not going to be a horrific film, because they wanted people to be able to actually come and enjoy the experience. Movie making was not what it is today. It was short one-reelers. They were just trying to entertain people. And so they made the elements of the story that were more horrific, more mystical and psychological for this film adaptation. As a matter of fact, they went so far as to print in their magazine, in making the film, the Edison company has carefully tried to eliminate all actual repulsive situations and to concentrate its endeavors upon the mystic and psychological problems that are to be found in this weird tale. Whenever, therefore, the film differs from the original story, it is purely with the idea of elimination of what would be repulsive to a movie picture audience. In this film, we have a very altered version of the Frankenstein story. So we have a young doctor, Dr. Frankenstein, portrayed here as a college-aged guy obsessed with studies, and he discovers, quote unquote, the mystery of life and death. And he appears to specialize in chemistry and or alchemy. And the creation process is really interesting in this movie because, like they said, they weren't going with the horrific elements like stitching together bits of cadavers and stuff like that. Instead, what they did is everything is made from potions and things like that. And so you see all these beakers and test tubes and this big cauldron, and he's more of an alchemist, really, than all of the scientific electrical gadgets that we're used to in our culture. And it's interesting to me that they go in this direction to avoid the more horrific elements of the story, because America in particular was such a religious country in this time that it seems to me to take the story in this direction makes Frankenstein himself an even worse blasphemer, because where before Frankenstein was assembling bodies to be like God, it's almost like this iteration seeks not just to be equal with God, but to improve upon him, which to me gives him, more hubris. Gives him more of an ego.
I'm going to improve on God's creation.
Right? He's trying to create the perfect human body is what he's doing in this film. And so the film tells us, instead of a perfect human being, the evil in Frankenstein's mind creates a monster. And I find that to be interesting. Frankenstein, he's basically been jumping up and down with excitement during the creation process, but when he sees what he's ultimately spawned, with its long deformed fingers creeping toward him, he becomes completely horrified and he flees. It's interesting to me that it's his state of mind, basically, his hubris, his ego, that makes his creation evil. Whenever we see the monster being formed in that cauldron, it's 1910. Special effects are like non-existent. The way that they did it was they made a dummy of the monster and they set it on fire and filmed it. And then they showed it backwards as this charred thing being brought to life. You see it kind of coming together and becoming the monster in the end.
I just love that from the start.
Yeah,
there's a long tradition of special effects people going, I don't know, let's set it on fire. Like nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed. That's right.
100 years, and they're still just like, I don't know. Have we tried setting it on
Let's
fire?
blow it up.
All right, yeah. Make sure you're
Let's record it backwards, but blow it up first.
Right, that's right. That's right. This is going to be awesome, guys.
You're so right. You are so right. but it's crazy whenever you just fool around like that, what you wind up coming up with, and what they do wind up coming up with here looks really cool.
Oh, we should also tell people that you can find this on YouTube.
Yes,
easy to find. We'll put it in the show notes.
Available. It's out of copyright. You don't have to worry about that. Just you can go and watch it guilt free.
Yeah, it was a fascinating take on the monster, because what we know as Frankenstein, right, is Karloff, and that is the quintessential. It was cemented, and it has stayed that way. Largely, it is the stereotype of Frankenstein, and but this monster, 1910, was not. It was stringy-haired, long-fingered. It looked more like a lagoon creature, right? It looked like another monster that we're going to be talking about later, and I'm sure in one of Ray's classic film tours down the road. And I thought it was just like magical to have my concept of what Frankenstein is be challenged by 1910 visuals. That was an extraordinary sort of awareness. Now, then you bring up all the mystical stuff, and the fact that that in an effort to dismiss with repulsion, they end up with something that is actually a weirdo love story at the end, that the monster sort of vanishes with true love's kiss, kind of a Disney approach. I thought that was another thing that I never in a million years would have expected from the first appearance of this monster.
That is like a really weird direction to take it in. It's fantastical. It's completely different from the source material. Kyle?
We're at this point, 1910, we're about 20 years from a horse running. Like the first motion picture is like a horse running, and now 20 years later they're doing a full-on horror story. It's like it's almost like the movies were waiting. I'm getting very Terry Pratchett here. The movies were waiting for someone to like make the breakthrough, and then it just flooded and everybody just went, yes. The idea that we've gone from like cowboy shoots gun at screen and then
train approaches station,
exactly, and like from the 80s to the 90s now we're doing full-on dramatic horror stories with special effects and all that kind of stuff. It's just amazing how fast people glommed onto a new storytelling thing, and we're like, oh, now I want to tell stories with this. It's I don't know, there's something in the human condition of just from like I don't know. What are we going to do with this? Like, okay, you got the footage of a horse. What are we going to do? What if?
Yeah.
It's
my
just
question for both
the
of you
ingenuity
guys,
of it just amazes me.
Yeah.
My question, I mean, I talked about what is scary. I mean, do we have a sense that even in their efforts to, I mean, they're making a monster movie.
Sure.
Like, were there efforts to titillate and scare people the way horror movies are made now, and we just aren't scared because of time?
I think that a big deal of it is where we are in time, because what was frightening and what was taboo to an audience then is different than what is frightening and what is taboo to us now. I think we are very much more desensitized to the world than the world of 1910 was.
That's true.
At the same time, I think you just said it, though, that what is frightening to us today is still challenging the for lack of a better word, the godly order of creation, life and death, right? And that might be one of the reasons that this character holds on and is something that we're talking about today, because it's still scary, whether it's Karloff or someone else. Like that challenges something that's not horrific, not terrifying, but certainly causes that sort of internal squeamishness.
It can also be that because of just trying to get like where people's heads were at the time. I was thinking like, okay, so this is like 40 years after Civil War, but like I'm like, so is that a factor? And I'm like, well, no, because by 1900 everybody's like, it's the future. So I think it's interesting that when you see this, because at that point science was awesome. Like everybody was on board. Like electric lights, great. Trolleys, fantastic. Everybody was like the future's coming. Mr. Edison's bringing power to the people. Like it was thing. And so when you see this Frankenstein, it's not how science is awful and has corrupted and is terrible. No, it's very more like you say, alchemistic. It's like everything is very much, it's sort of a weird, almost mystical, rather than like using the power of electricity to reanimate the dead. It was like, no, it's like something weird in a basement.
It's really closer to black magic than science.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and the fact that it serves as an able metaphor for fear of technology's advancement beyond that which we can control. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, that's it for me. I mean, this movie is every bit as appropriate today as Megan, right? Like that's another Frankenstein story, and it's amazing. And it's also, you created an AI that you could barely control, right? Like that's where we're still making these movies because we don't understand the technology that we're putting out into the world. So that's scary.
And the biggest thing I think is life and death, the mystery of life and death.
Yeah.
That is a theme that will never tire as long as humanity is in existence, I believe, because we are always going to be born and we are always going to die, and we're always going to wonder why. And the fact that it is the biggest mystery, it makes it such good fodder for cinema or for any kind of entertainment, really. And all of that being said, we've really touched on the creation process. Let's talk really quick about the monster himself, because like you said, Pete, he's very different than what we expect because we're so used to like the Boris Karloff iteration. Here, he basically looks like a giant potato.
He does.
Which can be scary.
It can be scary.
So many eyes.
He basically looks like a troll in this. He's very deformed looking. He has long, gruesome fingers. He has a tall forehead, huge feet, contorted face. Unlike the monster in the novel and the other film adaptations, this one seems to be something that is spawned from evil, not something that becomes evil or acts evil after the fact. You know what I mean?
It's unnatural
because it's a reflection of the evil within Frankenstein. And in the end, it's Frankenstein's love for Elizabeth that makes the monster disappear. In other words, I read it as it's Frankenstein putting away his ego, putting away his desire to see God bested. It's kind of like a Tower of Babel thing whenever they tried to build the tower to reach God and God taught them a lesson. You wondered, how did audiences react to this at the time? The newspapers and magazines saw this as the most remarkable thing ever committed to a film. The premiere, which was on April 9th, 1910, saw a lot of people praising this movie. However, it also did spawn some of the first horror critics. There was one, W. Stephen Bush, who wrote in the Moving Picture World publication, "I have the sincerest admiration for the Edison and Vitagraph studios, but it must be said with all due deference to these distinguished producers that such films as Frankenstein, while delightful literature to coroners, undertakers, gravediggers, and morgue keepers, fail to please the general public. Fail to please is putting it mildly. Death scenes and executions are interesting. Interesting historical reading when well described, but a portrayal of these things on a living screen may well be dispensed with." End quote.
Man, I want to follow his Rotten Tomatoes profile.
Yeah, somebody's flexing his English degree.
Now I want to look this guy up on Rotten Tomatoes and see if they keep track of his review.
Well, so it is actually really interesting. Like we're sort of, I don't know, how many decades after are we on the heels of maybe 40 years of the Brothers Grimm, like actively writing, through the mid 1800s. Like I feel like there was this cultural gestalt of like, here, we're going to write about trolls and things that scare us. And I can see that committing these images to film would be jarring, just as it's jarring to see some of the things that we see today on film for the first time, until we get used to it. So I get it. I get that the shock of change. but that's a pretty dated review.
If you think about it, you could look at this movie as the first body horror.
Kind of, yeah, right? That's actually interesting.
That thought just occurred to me. But anyway, so that is, in a nutshell, the 1910 Frankenstein. After this film came out, there were actually two other Frankenstein movies made between 1910 and 1931, but they are both lost. One was made in 1915, and the other one was an Italian film that was made, I think, in 1919. It wasn't until 1931 that we got a feature-length version of the monster of the Frankenstein story, the first talkie, and that is the one that we probably all know the best, Frankenstein 1931, directed by James Whale.
It's moving. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
1931 is actually a pivotal year in horror history, and Universal, this was a big year for them in particular. They had just put out Dracula early in the year, and it was their first horror talkie, and it was a huge success. And the studio, as you can imagine, wanted to follow it up fast with another horror film. So the Dracula movie was based off of a play by Peggy Webling. So they went back to Peggy Webling and bought the rights to her play adaptation of Frankenstein. Now, young filmmaker Robert Florey is an interesting name in horror history. He wrote the first draft of Frankenstein and initially wanted to direct it. And he really had to kind of prove himself to Universal. So after the shooting of Dracula, Florey took Bela Lugosi, Edward Van Sloan, and Dwight Fry and made a test reel for Universal to show that he had a proof of concept for Frankenstein. This has never been seen before, this footage, and it's like all these horror fans are hoping someday Universal's going to find this reel of footage because everyone wants to see what Lugosi would have been like as the monster. Lugosi thought at first that he was being offered the role of the Doctor, and he was actually kind of pissed whenever he found out he was going to be the grunting, ogreish monster. Because you got to realize this is a guy who he was the sex symbol of his day in his country. And he comes over here and everyone thinks, oh, this is just, the funny talking foreigner. Mm-hmm. And so Robert Florey makes his test footage. No one knows exactly what the reaction to the footage was. Apparently, it is said that when Carl Laemmle Jr., who was the head of production at Universal and the founder, Carl Laemmle Sr.'s son, when Jr. saw the test, he reportedly burst out laughing while watching it. It wasn't very good. They apparently had Lugosi made up in the grayish clay-colored paint, and in his words, he looked like a scarecrow, and he just was not happy, and apparently you could tell it from the footage. Anyway, they decided not to go with this filmmaking team of Robert Florey and Bela Lugosi. Those two went on to work on the film Murders in the Rue Morgue, which would come out in early 32. And that is when Universal wound up selecting the one and only James Whale. Are either of you familiar with James Whale, apart from the Frankenstein films? He hasn't done too much. He's done The Invisible Man, Showboat, Waterloo Bridge.
Yeah, I mean, Showboat. I've seen Showboat, but I'm not really familiar with James Whale until, looking at these these two films. I wouldn't say I'm a real, whalehead.
And to be honest, that's really what he's known for, are the monster films, to his chagrin.
Yeah.
But at the time, he had just had a recent success with Waterloo Bridge, and that had made him an A-lister. So Laemmle Jr. decided to use him as the director. This is an interesting take on the movie, because while it is the most well-known, it definitely is not very reliable to the source material. As a matter of fact, I think more people probably know this than the source material.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's a really interesting take on the story, and very different from the 1910 movie. The big thing with this, especially with the creation scene, was that it needed to be big and it needed to be believable. Whenever they got all of these elements together in the laboratory, James Whale wanted the viewer to think that guy could have totally just made a guy from all of this stuff going off in his laboratory. There is so much going on in this laboratory. It's one of the greatest sets ever designed. All of the machinery was built for this movie.
That is one of the things I would say for both of these movies that I was stunned by, was the size of the sets and the ability that they had to move the camera from space to space unbroken was extraordinary. I felt like, in terms of having a sense of place in the film, I very much felt like I was in this place.
Yeah, anything you watch this era, when it's always like, even the 1910 one, it's basically like it's a set. Like it very clearly, and the camera is mounted, and there it is. When I was watching this and going, okay, what's going to be? And the camera slid from one side into the next room. I was like,
crazy.
It was so exciting.
Amazing.
I was like, I don't know how you did that, James Whale, but like, man, like that.
Smart.
Every time they would do that, it would be so exciting to me, because I'm so used to the static shots, but static establishing shot, extreme close up, and then back to that was a big shot. A lot of that. But yeah, every time they would sort of move it around, I was always super impressed.
Oh, especially whenever you get those shots that look upward into the high ceilings of the laboratory set. Specifically whenever he's talking to Fritz, who's up tying off the kites or whatever on the roof for the lightning to hit. And you just see the enormity of the space around him. It's kind of like, screw you, Citizen Kane. This movie showed off all of this wonder first. What did you guys think of the creation sequence here? Because it is quite the feast for the eyes.
It's one of these things like just like Young Frankenstein being my main frame of reference for a lot of stuff. It's sort of, I feel like I've seen it 100 times, even though I hadn't really ever watched it like in context and stuff too. And it was amazing, now that we're talking about the difference of the sort of alchemaic version of the 1910 now to hear post World War One, very different time, and very much like science with a capital S and a big exclamation mark at the end. Like it's a big thing of like having this incredibly complex scientific lab with electricity and Jacob's ladders everywhere, in a old Gothic setting, castle, in mill, whatever, like to have it, the juxtaposition of the two, like that, and then obviously to be defying God in this place, doing it. I thought, especially for the time, it was great. And it's interesting how, watching the movie, how much he'll like dig in on. I'm like, oh, I want to watch the entire process of this, and then other times we're just like, nah, we'll just jump ahead, like we'll cross the continent, 6 months later or whatever, just not even caring about that. But like this, and I think take this and also the grave digging thing, like you start like over in a grave watching him die, and you watch the guy in a full 3-piece suit,
love that,
Very fill
classy.
A grave, and then like go over to them going and emptying the grave. I was like, why are we spending so much time on this? But it's process. It's the process. It's part of like what he wants to show, the getting your nails dirty kind of stuff. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I think even that sequence still holds up.
Yeah.
Again, the frame of reference of Young Frankenstein notwithstanding, the fact that this movie is about a guy Benjamin Franklining another body to life with the magic of electricity.
Yes.
And I say magic of
Bride,
electricity with heavy air quotes.
Directly, Benjamin Franklin.
Yes. Yeah. Get the kites ready. And I think that was just a fascinating process to watch them pull this all together and to see just how well it kind of holds up once you're in the mythos of the film. Like I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. And part of that might be because, again, the transfer and the restoration were so impeccable. It feels like I'm watching a black and white movie that was shot, with an Arri Alexa. Like it felt really, really current. And so that is a real gift. Thank you, Kyle. That is something that I really sort of got. I understood. There's one other piece that hits me, that James Whale was openly gay through his life, and it strikes me that here he is with an affinity for making this movie about a man and his male manservant partner bringing other men back to life, and all of the challenges that come into those relationships. And I wonder if that didn't have any other impact on his interpretation of the story. He had a difficult life and was, apparently lived in the end of his life dealing with multiple strokes and ended up killing himself in his own pool. And that is a hard way to go. I wonder how much of that struggle of his grief we're seeing on screen and in some of these films.
Well, like Ray, you were talking about having that they commissioned the script and didn't really like the first one anyway, because that thing with James Whale read it and did not like it because it was a monster, like a real full on, like the creature shows up and just starts killing and stuff. And he wanted to do much more of a story of a lost soul.
Exactly.
So it's very, and I was amazed at, like when I watching this, like now in context, I've seen the images from it 1,000 times and parodied and everywhere else. And even Universal loves to just trot out the same 10 shots in all of their trailers for how great of movies we made. But to how instantly I am empathetic to the monster. Like from when he arrives,
yeah,
right.
Yes.
I just I'm like I am on his side, from the beginning of and I guess that's James Whale and that's Karloff too. I mean, that. I'm not like, oh God, it's the horrible thing. I'm just like, oh, this poor guy. Like he didn't ask for any of this.
He didn't ask for any of this. My God, that is exactly what I thought. And what's so funny about it is that it's even more. The Bride of Frankenstein is lampooned far more than this movie because of that shot with the hair and the and she's so scared, and yet I felt so sad for everybody in that movie, particularly the monster.
Yes.
It oozes grief, real, legitimate sadness. It's not a joke in this movie. And Young Frankenstein has done these movies no favors because it's made this stuff legit funny. But these movies are sad movies first. They're sad. We don't get the iceberg, going off into the sea. It's not quite that sad, but my goodness, these are sad movies.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The other thing I thought from Mary Shelley all the way through pretty much every adaptation is Frankenstein, the Dr. Frankenstein, whatever you call him, Henry or Victor, is a deadbeat dad. Every because basically look what I made a kid, I have to take care of it, I have to feed it, I have to, oh no, I don't want any part of this. and it's and you see instantly he just leaves it with Fritz, and
he
Fritz instantly is tormenting him, torturing him,
whipping him. It's awful.
No thought of kindness or in Frankenstein, I don't even think we ever see him eat.
No.
Right. I think you're right.
They just instantly oh look, I made a thing. I don't want to take care of it. Just it's like a stray dog. Just put it in the kennel and I don't want to even think about it.
Let's make a new one. Let's see if we can make it better. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And you know what, Pete, you brought up a great point about James Whale's open homosexuality, because it was one of the reasons I love this film so much is because of its portrayal of the monster. And I think the portrayal of the monster works so well because of James Whale, the director, and because of Boris Karloff. James Whale, like you said already, living as an open homosexual in the 1930s.
Yeah.
No
right.
joke.
What I cannot begin to fathom the amount of guff this guy had to put up with because of that. The stuff that I can try to imagine is horrible enough. The backlash and the hate that he's facing because of who he is, that I'm sure he put some of that into the portrayal of the monster. Now, Karloff is another interesting story because Karloff grew up part Indian. He grew up in an English family, and he grew up with that darkly complected skin that caused him to be the brunt of hate amongst his classmates. He knows what it's like to go through being shunned, and that really shows through in his portrayal of the monster. So both of those guys really had something to add to how we feel for this character.
And being hated on sight.
Yes.
Right.
And
Without ever saying a word.
And it's a remarkable testament to these people that we can still feel that for this character almost 100 years later.
That's a really, really good point. Like, so much of this story is also a story of privilege, and the privilege to be able to walk unencumbered by, presence in English society in this case. But the monster has no ability to walk invisibly through society. That is a
really, really good point too, Pete. Because look at all the chances that Frankenstein is given.
Yes,
like everyone just comes like, oh, I don't know if you should be doing this. I don't know. And the big thing isn't, oh, let's stop these unnatural experiments. It's let's get him to his wedding.
Yeah, exactly. The monster who we've already said,
your weird side hobby, but let's get you properly married first.
Monster didn't ask for this and will never have the ability to walk through the world. Popular, walk through the populace without being noticed.
Let's take a look just real quick at how the monster was created, because I love looking at just the creation process, not just on screen, but behind the scenes. And I didn't have all the information on the 1910 movie, but for this one, once Karloff got hired to play the monster, he immediately began working with Jack Pierce, who was the makeup artist at Universal, to create the look for the monster, because they really wanted this to stand out and to horrify people. And so what they ended up using a lot of cotton and collodion on Karloff's forehead to build up the head and to add the scars. And then they added greenish gray grease paint to make the appearance of death on the black and white film. They wanted him to look like he had just been dug up from the grave. And they also used some purple here and there for shadow. And then they put the stringy black wig on top of the deformed head. Now, it's interesting because Jack Pierce did such a great job on this makeup design, but Karloff had some really great input too. It was his idea to take his dental bridge out to make his cheeks look more sunken, which I thought was an amazing effect. Especially,
I had no idea that was going on. Fascinating.
But you only see it in this movie because he had to wear it in the second film because the monster was required to speak. So you only really get the full effect of it in the 31 movie. And so it was his idea to do that. It was also his idea to add an extra layer of wax makeup on the top eyelid to make them more droopy and dead looking, which again really does add to the look of the monster. The boots that this son of a gun has to wear were 13 pounds a piece.
Wow.
His calves must have been mighty by the end.
Massive.
Right? And he was, I think it was 41 at the time. And he was in his early 40s. I think it was 41. I don't know his exact age at the time, but he was not a young man. The suit that he wore had the shortened sleeves to make him appear bigger, or as Karloff put it, as a gigantic and gawky big boy who had outgrown his rompers.
I love the behind the scenes pictures of him like with a cup of tea probably and a cigarette just like hanging on the set. Like
right.
Oh, hello.
Have you seen that picture?
Yeah.
Have you guys, had you seen much other Karloff stuff?
Yes.
But I mean, it took 81 films before he was discovered by Whale.
Oh, yeah.
To get cast in this. He was a busy dude.
Yeah.
Just in the business. Like
Working character actor.
Yeah, working character actor. This was not his, this was not, this was a discovery and a breakout role, but certainly not, he was not an inexperienced performer.
I was watching
Definitely.
some of it as my family was sort of drifting in and out, like they're not really interested in any of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so they came in, and so my daughter, my teenage daughter, came in and was sort of looking at it, watching one of the scenes with him in it, and she was saying, "Oh, if they did this today, I bet you Doug Jones would do a really good Frankenstein." And I was like, and we love Doug Jones. He's fantastic. He's like, obviously, for those you don't know, he's from The Weight of Water.
The Shape of Water.
Shape of Water. The Shape of Water. Yeah,
Yeah.
obviously Oscar nominated for that. Like, he does full suit.
Yes.
But I was thinking, but I sort of I'm like, yeah, obviously he would do a great job. But I was also going, what's fantastic about this makeup in particular is how much of his actual face you get to see and he gets to use, because
Yeah.
a lot of times with modern makeup stuff too, they just want to cover everything. It's like I think one of the worst sins of it now is the CG version of it too, where you watch, like, my particular hill I will die on is watching Andy Serkis's original performance from Last Jedi and then watching the Snoke CG, and you go, what were you guys thinking?
What was that?
Because
Yeah.
Andy is so amazing and evocative, and then they just layered on CG. So I think that what's great about this is that all the effect is basically from eyebrows up, but like all the rest of it, you get to like the actor's instrument, you get to see his eyes, his emotion, like his mouth, like all of that is actually Karloff.
Mhm.
And I think goes a long way towards us empathize with it, as opposed to a Creature from the Black Lagoon or whatever, where it's a full prosthetic.
Yeah.
I think it was a great choice on their part, which I easily could have just done a full fake nose and all of this stuff. So I think they did a great job on that.
Well, I mean, man, that Doug Jones comparison is great too, because man, did they trap him in the Saru face too?
Right.
Like, he's such an incredible character actor on Star Trek Discovery, but man, he's like, what could he do?
Right.
He's so good.
And the Creature of Black Lagoon obviously is the direct connection, but he's a great physical performer in that I can see him. I can see any creature walking and know that's Doug Jones. Even we were watching Batman Returns, and one of the clowns walked by in the background. I'm like, I think that's Doug Jones, and by God, it was.
Really?
Yes, he has a just like once you become like a super fan, and I've also have met him multiple times. He is as nice of a guy as you would hope he would be. Could not be a greater dude. But once you sort of get that gate, like every time it shows up or whatever it says, and like not to belittle any of his performances, but like once you know, and you go, oh, that is a good. But yeah, but that being back to Karloff. I think they did it right in here and in The Mummy, I would say, where they let him do what he's good at, which is like that good old-fashioned silent actor face acting.
Yeah. And it's even more incredible when you realize he has no dialogue in this film.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
We've looked at the monster here. We've looked at the creation process a bit. One thing I do want to mention that I think is interesting to note just from here on out, Mary Shelley in her novel does not seem to give much detail as far as the creation process itself. And it's interesting, with that being the case, to see how each of these filmmakers, obviously Universal does pretty much the same thing with theirs, but it's interesting to see how all these filmmakers interpret the creation process on screen, because everyone does it differently. Surely there's a lot of influence from this film in a lot of later iterations, but I think that this is one of the key aspects to take a look at and examine whenever we look at the evolution of the character, of the story. I mean, I think in the book, all she says is, "I've gathered the instruments of life around me," which is an interesting phrase to use. And so a big influence on James Whale for that was Metropolis, which Pete, you and Andy have covered on the next reel,
Yeah.
which is a great movie. And I'm sure once you have seen Metropolis and you think about it, you know what? I totally see that going on in this film. As a matter of fact, he even wrote it in the script, all these machines and doodads are going off, such as in Metropolis. And so that was just a big vision for him as far as the creation process went. And it's also interesting to note that I think this is the only adaptation I've seen where it happens. Frankenstein has an audience during the creation process. He allows Dr. Waldman, Elizabeth, and Victor Moritz to basically become audience surrogates. They're watching him as he creates the monster. And I found that to be interesting because in most other adaptations, he's very secretive of what he's doing. Yeah. But it does give us that audience surrogate relationship. We see their reactions. They're playing the audience basically. And it's also interesting to note that there's the line after he's created the monster, Henry Frankenstein says, "By God, now I know what it feels like to be God." And that was a line that was cut from the initial release because it was thought to be way too blasphemous. And it was only just recently put back into the film. And that was one of the things that really set people off. Initially, Henry Frankenstein was supposed to die at the end of this movie. He gets thrown from the windmill at the end and he dies, and you see his lifeless body and they carry him away. However, even as they were making this, they thought, you know what, this might make for a good sequel.
Already with the cinematic universe.
Right. Franchise potential. It's got franchise potential.
Yeah. The Frank CU.
Too Fast, Too Frankenstein.
And I think that they made that in 1974. No, I'm kidding.
But what's amazing to me is, I've not watched a lot of stuff from this era. That like when the movie is over, it's over. Like it's like get out. I mean, it's amazing how they go from like this big dramatic thing, throws the body over, fire. The people are like, yeah, we killed the monster, yeah, and they cut to like happy maids bringing a drink, and a guy walks out like everything will be okay. Credits. I'm like. Credits. Yeah. We're done.
Endings were very much more abrupt.
Yeah.
Like there's like, and get out of the theater. Like, okay.
But and like I said, they thought, there's some sequel potential here, so they decided last minute to add in a scene where the body of Victor hits one of the sails before it hits the ground, softening the blow, and he lives. And then they also added that final scene that you just mentioned, which, by the way, doesn't even include Colin Clive or Mae Clark as Henry or Elizabeth in the background. They're fuzzy, and it's just two other actors and the Baron. And they're talking, everyone, like you said, everyone's going to be fine. Happy ending. Definitely difference from the novel.
Can you talk a little bit about like what the reception to this is? Like, what do you know about like how? I mean, I know it was a hit, but like, do you have an idea like what that actually meant in 1931?
Yeah, sure. So, whenever the movie came out, it was a big deal. Matter of fact, Carl Laemmle Sr. thought it was going to be too frightening. It got to the point where he actually had Karloff wear a veil but walking from set to trailer because he didn't want pregnant secretaries to accidentally miscarry.
Oh, no, he did not. Oh, God.
Oh, the 30s.
Oh, my God.
So that's why he, after the test screening, he even added that prologue to the film. How do you do? And Carl Laemmle feels that you shouldn't watch this without a word of warning. And the movie,
and immediately the next thing is Carl Laemmle's name 3 times on the title card. I just before anybody else, it's like Carl Laemmle presents a Carl Laemmle production of a Carl Laemmle film.
Exactly. But the movie did incredibly well. It had a budget of just over $262,000 at the time. It made in the box office $1.4 million.
In 1930s dollars?
Yes.
Yeah. Like even so, even if it was like $1 to get in theaters. I don't think it was. I think we were still in the Nickelodeon sort of era. Like they're still paying like 2 bits or whatever. That's a lot of people seeing that movie.
By 1943, Universal reported it had earned a profit of $708,871. I don't know what the rentals
and also
means.
studio math.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, but by 1953, the Frankenstein re-releases, because the movie had been re-released several times in the next 2 decades. All of the re-releases earned gross profit of $12 million. But as far as critically, everybody thought that this was just the cat's pajamas. Film Daily thought that it was a gruesome, chill-producing, and exciting drama that was produced intelligently and lavishly with a grade of photography that is superb. And that's the only one I'm going to quote outright.
So I want to ask you a question that Pete asked on the Discord a while back that I'm wondering about.
All right.
Was this scary?
It was.
Like for the people of the 30s, was it just like, oh, this I'm enjoying this motion picture which has the frights to it, or was it actually like people like legitimately like, this is a scary movie?
I
know you weren't there, but like,
no,
what's your interpretation of the reception?
From what I have known of from what I've read about the film, people thought it was scary in the sense of like a superstitious scary,
okay.
or something like that. The people definitely showed up in droves, and they were thrilled and titillated by it. I would assume that they were just as scared of it as people in today's audiences are scared of Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. You have to understand that back at this time, movies were movies, and people didn't really think of them as much as like a particular genre as they do today. Like people weren't like, oh, I love all the horror movies, I'm going to go see all the horror movies. It wasn't billed as a horror movie. It was billed as a horror show, sort of like it had some horrific things in it, but really it was a morality play.
And the fact is, you're going to a movie because it's a movie. It's a technological wonder, and it's awesome to be present at this time in history. It doesn't really matter what you're seeing.
Right.
It's the same reason we go see Avatar 2.
It's the experience.
Too soon?
So then, obviously the franchise potential has been established. And so 4 years later, they decide to revisit this world, and literally like from like the very end of it, like to pick up, like even just to roll back the clock a little bit. Like we're going to roll back like, half an hour or whatever.
A few minutes.
Right. Yeah. And one of the first movie sequels, and it's also one of the first to actually just pick up right where I left off. And but it actually took 4 years to make, like you said.
The Bride of Frankenstein. Stand back! She ate me.
They couldn't get James Whale back right away because James Whale didn't want to be involved in something he had just done. He didn't want to remake something. And so, they searched, Universal shopped around for a while. Eventually did come back to James Whale. They actually had a team of writers this time. There were 9 different writers credited for Bride of Frankenstein, although you can definitely tell Whale's mark in the writing. when it happens, because he definitely, took what they had and made his own thing with it. He put his own stamp on it. Brings back as many people as he can from the first movie. Colin Clive comes back as Henry. They couldn't get Mae Clark to come back as Elizabeth, so they got Valerie Hobson, who was only 17 at the time.
I thought she was great. I thought she was actually much more dynamic than in that part than we had in the first movie.
And that's just one of those situations where Mae Clark, who played Elizabeth in the first film, was a friend of James Whale, which is why she was cast, and Valerie Hobson was a contract player.
Becomes a Katie Holmes situation from
exactly.
Batman Begins to Dark Knight.
Then we have the new character introduced of Dr. Pretorius, which is a very interesting character who is actually
was amazing. How has he not been reprised in like every other thing?
Everything,
right?
Like, oh boy, like the game has changed. I am all in on Dr. Pretorius.
Yeah,
I would like to think it's because no one could possibly play this part the way Ernest Thesiger plays him, because Ernest Thesiger is one of those actors who just oozes personality, and whenever he does, he dominates a part, man. And he completely dominates this part in every scene that he's in. He takes complete control of. But what's interesting is that the part was written and conceived for Claude Rains.
Oh, that would have been. I think that
would have been really interesting,
honestly. Yeah.
It's not known why Rains didn't ultimately play the part, but when he didn't, it went to Ernest Thesiger, who was a friend and colleague of James Whale, who had also worked with him and Boris Karloff in The Old Dark House, which is an amazing movie, by the way. Now this is interesting. The Baron, Henry's father, story-wise, is supposed to have died near the beginning of the film, but they cut all of that stuff out. There are deleted scenes of a funeral for him, and he's just kind of not there. But I want to just really talk about the monster, because here is where the monster really shines.
Yes.
Where we definitely got a great performance from Karloff in the first movie. The second one is arguably where Karloff just becomes a powerhouse. And Jack Pierce really outdid himself too, because he took the makeup that he had created for the first film, and instead of just having one makeup design, he had several makeup designs for this one to show the various stages of decay and distress that the monster goes through during the film. Because at the very beginning, the monster's crawling out of the windmill fire. The building has just been on fire.
There's watching this is like, obviously the difference in time and style and stuff too, but in Bride of Frankenstein especially, there are so many things where I'm like, why did you make this choice? Like in that particular scene, it's a great thing of like, let's roll back the clock and see what really happened. And like the like, I have to make sure he's dead. And so the guy, the father goes and it goes and he falls in and the monster is still alive and still there and goes after him. And they like big action thing. He's like throttling the guy. Cut to a shot of an owl. And then cut back to the action and the monster's climbing out. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Was that an owl? Like, why is
Look, who else is here? It's Friendly Owl.
Like, I'm like, is there an owl underneath the burned down mill? Like in this cave, is there an owl in this cave? And then he climbs up and they go the same thing, like the mother's there, like he grabs the arm and like, the monster's back.
Yeah.
Cut to another shot of the owl again. Like, why is the owl here? Why? And then
you got to get your coverage, man. You got to get your coverage.
Like, what? James? Why the owl?
That was funny.
It's just it's one of those things where I'm like, I don't know if this is like a part of the cinematic language. I just don't understand. But every once in a while he would do that. I don't know if, and that might have been an editing choice. That might have been like a directing thing. They're just like, oh, we can't show this horrific violence, so owl. Yeah.
I never really even thought about that before, but you're right. That really is a very strange choice for a cutaway.
Yeah, there's a couple times where that happened. I mean, like when the shepherdess or whatever, they just cut to a lamb. Like, okay, well, fine, the lamb is there. Like,
Sure, yeah.
I just when I make a movie, I'm just gonna have owls. Just
that could be your thing.
Cut to the owl.
Yeah, cut to the owl. Yeah, it's your trademark.
Quick, one thing that I just realized we didn't mention is Little Maria from the first film.
That was horrific.
Yeah. Especially
Little Maria is a girl down by the water.
And, a little bit comedic in the way they do it. And then cut to the shot of the father carrying the body through. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
It feels like, I mean, it's one of those that's so emotionally resonant that you lose track of the fact that there's a lot of circumstantial stuff going on here. Like, did he see the monster throw the girl into the thing to feed the ducks? Like, it felt like we don't do that movie as like a movie by minute podcast, because you're going to spend a lot of time dwelling on some of these things, and that there's very little value in that, because the truth is it is a deep emotional low, this segment, and this is what gives us the torches and pitchforks mentality.
And that's what's interesting is that scene is another example of Universal cutting something only to really make it worse. They didn't want to show the monster killing the girl, so the scene of him actually throwing her into the water was cut out of initial releases. And so you just get the idea that he killed her by the water, and makes it much more fiendish than it actually was, because the context that the cut gave was that he maliciously acted towards this girl. But then we see he's just trying to continue playing the game of throwing the flowers in and making boats, and he throws her in and she doesn't float. And all of a sudden he's just like, what the, he's just doesn't know what to do. And that is the character that I love. And this is the character that we get more of in this film. Who saw the Jesus imagery?
Not exactly subtle.
James Whale had so much more creative freedom on Bride, and this was one of the examples of how he used it. He is a huge fan of irony, and he loved the fact that where Christ was died and saved everyone for their sins and then rose again, here the monster has risen from the grave and then he's being killed by everybody. He thought that was a good bit of irony.
Well, and also like when he's in with the beggar, which the blind man, which we'll talk about. What is he given? He's given bread and he's given wine by a priest.
And
like, not a coincidence.
And you know what? Let's just jump into that, because that's the next real big part of the story, is the monster's story arc with this old man this old blind man that he finds in the woods. And we all know how funny that part was in Young Frankenstein. And but this part luckily retains its heart in Bride, regardless of the funniness that we know from Mel Brooks.
Who is it? You're welcome, my friend, whoever you are. Who are you? I think you're a stranger to me. I cannot see you. I cannot see anything. You must please excuse me, but I'm blind. Come in, my poor friend. No one will hurt you here. If you're in trouble, perhaps I can help you. But you need not tell me about it if you don't want to. What's the matter?
Karloff really outdoes himself here, and he was worried that the monster's ability to speak would take away from the charm of the character, but it doesn't. And what he does here is gives us a character who, like you guys said, we're just wondering why all this bad stuff is happening to this guy that didn't even ask for it. And finally, He's getting some kindness. He's getting some love, attention, some happiness. One of my very favorite shots is whenever they're sitting there smoking and the old man is just playing his violin, and they're sitting there and the monster is just tapping his feet and smiling. And it's just such a happy moment. One of the very few in the movie, and it doesn't last long. Some other people come along and they see the monster with the old man and they mistake the situation, and they wind up burning down the old man's home and taking him away. And the monster's alone again, losing the one and only friend he ever had.
Well, that's right on. The entire Fellowship of Outcasts is right here. I mean, and this is a story we've seen played out, from here to Toy Story, right? These are the guys who are different, and they are on the verge of finding affinity, of creating a family of choice. They don't need any more from each other than what they have. And the horror in this sequence is that it is disrupted by the mass. And that is this is the ultimate, as Kyle says, yuck of one's yum. And it's heartbreaking. It is just a heartbreaking sequence because of it.
I say it is difficult to think of. Like when I first started, I'm like, oh no, I know exactly what this scene is because I know that scene in Frankenstein so well. But having it in the context of this, look what happens when the monster is shown kindness.
Yeah,
that is what makes this movie, is that the first person who actually takes a minute to not run and scream and fear and everything, to sit down, give him food, give him water, a healthy smoke,
right?
Show music, and from that, the monster is from just that afternoon is never the same again. Because from that encounter, he then is speaking, he is reasoning, he is communicating with the world because of that. And that goes along with your found family, your thing of outcast. Look what happens when you give sympathy and kindness to someone who has never seen it before. They don't destroy it and take everything from you. They change and pass that along.
Well, and look what that agency gives him in the final act of this movie. Right. Yeah. He now has agency to make his own life or death decisions.
Yeah. I almost feel that Frankenstein, the first film, isn't a full movie, because Bride of Frankenstein is the second half of the movie. The abrupt ending notwithstanding, this is the complete story. Which I had no idea going in.
Yeah. Did you watch them? You watch them back to back like that?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, I mean, within 12 hours of each other, essentially.
Yeah.
I
literally was ill, and I sat down and I watched them back to back in one sitting, and it was an abrupt ending because it felt like more of an intermission than anything else. I mean, together they're 2.5 hours, right? They're short movies, and they're worth watching this way because of exactly these reasons.
And also, because I know we're going to get to her, but also false advertising in the title, because this is Frankenstein's return. This is not Bride of Frankenstein, because
and we'll start sliding that way. So after this ordeal in the forest, the creature eventually stumbles upon who? Dr. Pretorius, who is collecting materials to do what? Build another monster, because the monster, as the posters declared, demands a mate.
Which also,
really?
No, he doesn't. He says, friend, which I was like, that's actually much more interesting and progressive than I thought.
And, that's one thing that kind of irks me a little bit with the advertising of movies from this era, is that a lot of times what they would do, and they did it with these movies, was they would come up with a poster or a slogan or a title, and they would just go off of that. And they say, okay, you writer, write something off of this. And it didn't always match. So Frankenstein's monster meets up with Dr. Pretorius. Pretorius takes him back to Henry Frankenstein. Now they're working toward making the woman.
Can we just talk about how weird Dr. Pretorius is, and the scene of the little people?
Yes,
that was amazing.
Why
Look,
is
I
this in
made
this movie?
minifigs.
That's so
I
weird.
made minifigs.
No, before there was Funko, there was Dr. Pretori.
That is a really interesting scene that really does a lot with the technology that they used in The Invisible Man. There's the scene where Dr. Pretorius is talking with Henry Frankenstein about his own misadventures into recreating life, and he comes out carrying this little cabinet is what they called it, and he's wearing
The
almost
cabinet of Dr. Pretorius.
exactly. And he's almost wearing like a priest's robes with the white collar, and he's got this black cap on, and it's all very suggestive of him being an alchemist and dabbling in black magic for what he's about to show us. And so he opens up this cabinet and he pulls out these jars, and again 1935, so you got to give them a lot of kudos for how they made this look. They have these little tiny people in these jars. And the way they shot it was similar, like I said, to The Invisible Man. They shot these people basically against a green screen, but what they used back then was black velvet. And they rotoscoped that image into a new background, which was Pretorius with the jar. And that's how we get that effect. The Invisible Man did a similar thing whenever he's unwrapping the bandages from his head and he's invisible underneath. He had black velvet underneath the bandages. So he has all these little, like Pete called the minifigs. And we see this black magic that he has. And he has a king, he has a queen, he has there was a priest, it was a pope, whatever it was, some vicar or something. There also he made one of Satan, which is like a man in a tuxedo and a cape.
Oh, that's perfect.
And he's like, perfect. I think he says something like, I think this one bears a strong resemblance to me, or do I flatter myself?
Yeah, right. Well, isn't that, I mean, like laying on the religious symbolism a little thick. It is like, once again, don't forget, we're testing God's will with life and death. Don't forget. Everybody remember? Okay.
And there's even, they cut this one because they thought it was going too far. They had Billy Barty playing a baby, an ugly, deformed baby that was supposed to be like, I think we should keep an eye on the growth and development of this one or something like that.
Oh,
and
the
it
voice
was just
of Figment from Epcot Center.
Yeah. So, and it was a really interesting sequence to show what they could do technologically in the last 4 years that was different from the first one, and B, how much different Pretorius is from Frankenstein, because Frankenstein seems much more like a scientist that went a little too far. Pretorius is like, you didn't go far enough, jump in the deep end.
Right. And obviously in this one, Henry is having a lot of he's a crisis of conscience. Like he doesn't want to do this stuff, but Pretorius is like full speed all the way.
Yes. And so with that scene is a very memorable part of this. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention as far as Pretorius or his creations go?
No, I really, what I really like about Pretorius also is then when he finally meets the monster, he's like, "Hey, want something to drink?" Like he's not like, oh, he's not freaked out like everyone else in the movie is. Like, but he's also not like, "Ooh, look at this strange marvel." He's just like, "Hey, man, sit down, talk to my skull."
And at the time, he's having a picnic in a crypt.
Yeah, pulls out some bones and set up a little altar, and he's just like having a conversation with a skull, and like, join us.
Well, and this was after he says, "I hope she has strong bones."
Yeah,
right. That line got me. I think the thing about this, it goes back to something you said earlier, Kyle, which is like, look what happens when you show the monster kindness. Like, he's showing the monster kindness, but the monster is innocence, and innocence does not know duplicity. And doesn't know he's being manipulated. And I think that's Pretorius's entire MO is like this, that all but, kneel before my great intellect.
He just needed a mustache so he could twirl it.
Yeah, he could twirl it, right.
And so then obviously they ultimately get around to creating the bride.
So in all of the Universal stuff that they like to show, they like to do their montages and things. They always have like the same sort of clips they use, and the clips they use basically is like the Bride of Frankenstein standing there with their hair all up, and then like the turn sideways in the screen. And
Yeah.
I was always I'm like, oh, this is the one I really want to see because people talk about the bride and how amazing it is, and so I'm like, I want to see what else the rest of it is. I assume that this scene happened like half an hour into the movie, not like 75 minutes.
Yeah.
Where I'm like,
Yeah.
and then I'm like, oh, that's it? Like that, like that's
Yeah.
all she gets to do. She's the
It turns
title
out-
character.
Yeah. Turns out she's hardly a thing
Yeah,
in the movie. She's hardly a thing.
yeah. They spend more time. I mean, the owl almost has more screen time.
It's funny because it's true.
I mean, I did like the that they had the same actress playing Mary Shelley.
Mary
Right.
Shelley, right? That was a nice touch.
That was a nice like connection between the two of them. But yeah, it was like I was like that character has had so much impact over the last 100 years almost, and yet has almost no screen time and no lines.
Yeah.
It's amazing
Also
how
Manchester.
big of an impact because that still to this day. I mean, she has more screen time in Beetlejuice's Rock and Roll Graveyard Review than she does in this
Right.
movie.
Right. Like her legacy is all wrapped up in "You stay, we belong dead."
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the end.
Right. And to be fair, while the film is titled Bride of Frankenstein, that really is, I'd argue, more time than the quote unquote bride gets in the novel. If I'm not mistaken, he starts to create the bride, but then decides against it. He never finishes it.
Yeah, he gets really because the monster basically is sort of manipulating him into doing this. Like it's like it's sort of like do this or die essentially.
Mhm.
And so he gets midway through and then goes, I can't do this anymore, and destroys the bride before she ever is brought to life.
But then in this one, we do get a completed bride, and we get that moment where we think finally the creature is going to get a break. He's going to have a friend that will stay with him, someone like him, and all will be well. Not so much. If those screams are any indication, not so much.
Yeah.
The bride sees him, reacts to him just as any other person would, and that's just kind of like, well, guess I better just die. And it's really a moving part of the story because he's like, you know what, you made me from the dead. I'm talking like a monster. You made me from the dead. You made her from the dead. This has all been a disaster. You just need to destroy all of this, including me and her, and go. And the monster has that great sacrifice at the end where he kills himself, the bride, and Pretorius, and allows Henry and Elizabeth to escape. If that had been the way that Universal ended their movies, then I think that these movies would probably be a little bit more well respected, in the sense that they wouldn't be as much treated like dumb novelties. But it is what it is. So all in all, what did you guys think of The Bride of Frankenstein?
I thought it was actually much stronger movie. I think that this is like, as James Whale was like, I feel like testing stuff out and trying things. Like there's some great shots with shadows and close up and stuff too. But in Bride of Frankenstein, he really gets to have a much bigger palette and to try a lot more things. Score being the biggest thing. Like I was amazing how
wonderful.
stark Frankenstein the movie. There's like almost no score. The score in this one, I was like, oh, I did not realize how much I missed this
Yeah.
until now. Here it is. I mean, I think everything that he sort of started in Frankenstein, the ideas are much more well developed in this one, making this like a complete piece with the two of them. I'm really surprised at how much I enjoyed Bride of Frankenstein, even though it does have probably the most abrupt ending of a movie. But it's just like, and go home.
Yeah. I really couldn't agree more. The ending is quite abrupt. It is also that sort of sacrifice, part of that sort of extra layer. The icing of grief is that the bride shows up, is created, is repulsed by Frankenstein because she is presented as a token. Right? She's created for Frankenstein with no context of the world she's living in. And it becomes like a weird sort of feminist horror parable, right? Like it is not a great story for her. And the fact that that creation has to be eliminated so soon is both the sort of like that. It's the right thing, right? That happens because she is created with no future, as we've seen with Karloff's portrayal of the thing, but also great sadness because she is given no opportunity of a future.
One of the few things I lament about the death of the Dark Universe, it never happened, was that they were going to make the Bride of Frankenstein the central character of it.
Yeah.
Like, and they're going to have a big budget, like even Guillermo del Toro, I think, was attached at one point, like a big budget remake of specifically Bride of Frankenstein, and like center the story on her. And I was like, that is that movie that needs to be made.
Yes. Yeah, I think it really does.
I'm really hoping that Del Toro does get to make that movie someday, even if it's not part of the Dark Universe, because that is the one man that I would trust with this.
Yeah. A guy who just lives his life by monsters, right? Like that is I thought Bride, I'm with you, Kyle. Like I thought Bride was an extraordinary partner to the original film. And to your point, Ray, like my kingdom for Universal monster movies that just end like this. Because the real lampoon of Bride of Frankenstein, that is Young Frankenstein, my hunch is it's actually a lampoon of all the movies that come after it using the tropes of this, because this was a really strong movie.
Yeah.
Not scary, but really fun and strong.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's very much it's very heavy on Son of Frankenstein references. And Son of Frankenstein is really the point where Frankenstein went downhill for this franchise. Just briefly, there were 6 movies that came after Bride of Frankenstein. Son of Frankenstein was the first one, and it's probably, if you were going to watch any of these, that's definitely the one to watch because it has one of Bela Lugosi's best performances ever. Some think even better than Dracula. He plays Igor. And
that's our introduction to Igor,
right?
Yes.
When in Bride of Frankenstein, my wife walked in and the guy was skulking around and killing the woman to get the heart and all that kind of stuff. She's like, "Oh, it's Igor." I'm like, "No, that's Hans or
Fritz."
Right. Oh, Fritz. That's Fritz. That's right. That's Fritz
with the abnormal brain, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Son of Frankenstein is itself a decent movie, but then we get Ghost of Frankenstein, which was the first one without Karloff. Chaney played the monster. The monster actually has no story whatsoever in Son of Frankenstein. He's really only used as a device. He's only used as a device in all the rest of these movies, actually. Ghost of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman is just a Wolfman sequel. House of Frankenstein, again, just House of Dracula, and then the last movie that featured the Frankenstein monster from Universal was 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which should have been called Abbott and Costello Meet Dracula because it's the last time Bela Lugosi played Dracula, and he's the main bad guy. But anyway, it's really not worth going into those movies like we did with these ones, because the monster doesn't do much of anything. But
so where does our journey take us next? Like what do we have to look forward to in the next?
The next time we talk about Frankenstein, I think we're going to pick it up in 1957, whenever Hammer did their version of the character with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And those movies, there were a series of those as well, but those focused on the doctor instead of the monster. There's a new creation in each movie. So those will be interesting. And we'll also talk about other studios that made Frankenstein films as well, because unlike this era, Universal was not the only ones making Frankenstein movies. So this brings us to the end of our first look at Frankenstein of this era. And it's an interesting era. It starts out strong, doesn't end so strong, but it is what it is. And it gave us the cultural icon of Frankenstein that we know today, for better or for worse. And next time we get back to this character, to this story, we'll take a look at what future iterations bring.
Forward into the past.
Forward into the past.
I'll take it. I'll see you guys in 1957.